We kind of rehearsed this, so Tom's going to start.
Well, I think it's there are a couple things to keep in mind as we go through today, which is going to essentially take us up to the present. And this is a story I'm going to be telling, and we're going to be sticking to it. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Joseph Campbell and his work with the hero's journey, but we got to looking at the newspaper and the newspaper business, and a couple things really came up, and one of them is that it's a business. There's a business story in what's happened in the daily newspaper, which and we still don't know yet if it's a tragedy or a comedy or a heroic story. But one thing I do know is that newspaper business is different, I think, from any other business that there is. And I think that's why people are here, and we want to take a look at and examine what's happened over the last half century and how we ended up in the situation today where local news seems to be losing its influence over the public debate. That difference is it's the only business that's mentioned in the Constitution, right there in the Bill of Rights, freedom of the press. And that's a significant difference between this business and I think any other. It's the only one mentioned in the Constitution. So I think I wanted to get those ideas across before we start in, because we do have a story to tell. And as I say, whether it's going to be a tragedy or a heroic story, well, we don't know yet.
All right, so we introduce ourselves. I think most people know Tom Honig, my husband, who was the editor for how many? 12 years, and you were a reporter before that.
Yeah.
And my name's Louise Yarnall, and I too was a journalist in Los Angeles, and our experiences were parallel in some ways and different in others. And we both added our press passes so you can see the souvenirs. So, and we have a 4-class set, and we went over our first class last week, which is grayed out, and then highlighted is what we're talking about today. How news has evolved, particularly local news. And really, it's going to be a business story, which, full candor, I had no interest in it. That wasn't why I was in business. I was in the business to tell stories. So we had to do a lot of research in this to understand the arc of the business. And you can see the upcoming classes there too, the topics. I wanted to reflect back to you all. This is a special group. If you look at a lot of media research today and who the audience is, it's really not a lot of people who read newspapers. But hello, we're among friends. You do read the newspaper a lot and magazines. Mm-hmm. And this is what you told us last week, that you follow national, international news, as well as government politics. And again, that makes you somewhat unusual. But we're so grateful for this group. And we did want to start with you all before we start to dive in. We wanted to just do a pulse check very quickly about, think back over your life over the last 40 years. How has your newspaper changed? And that can be any newspaper. It can be the Sentinel. It can be a national newspaper. How has it changed?
It's become skinny.
It's become skinny.
Yeah, and small.
And small, right?
I was going to say that the broadsheet has become narrower. There's at least one column shorter on the page. And yes, and thinner. Yeah, I always make a joke that sometimes the Sentinel feels like you can punch a finger on it.
Yes, right. And
Well, you caught onto a real sneaky thing that people did, that papers did. They cut down on the news haul by narrowing the web and lost the column. If you go to a newspaper that was put out in the early 60s or early 70s, you'd be amazed at how big it is. And that was a way to cut down on newsprint without letting anybody know you were actually doing that. You had a question?
now I've got 18 million.
Yeah. That brings up an important point. It really does. We'll get to that.
Yeah, it used to be the newspaper was the first thing where you got news, and now it might be the last because you've received so many other sources of information.
Louise, remember, you used movies were playing and
I used to have to look for what movies are playing and all that. It's to be, and it isn't that anymore. We all know it, and we'll talk more as we go through this. All right, so what happened? And so we're going to tell the story of local newspapers, the business through the hero's journey. And I'm going to start with, in the hero's journey, you always start with the ordinary world. And so it turns out we found an old YouTube video of the Sentinel, and we're going to give you a Sentinel tour. And I have to escape out of here and go into, bear with me here. We'll start with this part of the tour, and let me hit the full screen, and here we go.
Circulation and advertising.
So you know what? I apologize. I have to rewind. Sorry about that, everybody.
Publishing a newspaper every day requires the cooperation of highly skilled and talented people. In this video, we'll meet some of those people and see how they create a Santa Cruz County Sentinel. Our tour will take us through various departments responsible for building the daily newspaper. Circulation and advertising. Newsroom. Computer systems. The press room.
And I'm going to take you to a few more places here. I had to kind of splice through this a bit. And now we'll do the next one. We're going to dive into the newsroom for a moment.
Here, reporters and editors write the first draft. They tell Santa Cruz County about itself every single day. Sentinel writers, editors, and photographers compile enough information each day to fill a medium-sized book. Reporters and editors meet throughout the day and discuss the stories they are working on. During the day, reporters and photographers travel throughout the county, either to illustrate news events or to document the unexpected as it happens. As the day goes on, reporters become writers and sit at their computers to write the story. As 5 o'clock grows near, editors meet to decide what's going to make it into the next edition.
And bear with me. I have to do one more. Am I okay?
Yes, you could click the OK up there.
Oh,
Get rid of that. You can minimize the gallery.
minimize the
Yeah,
gallery.
there you go.
There you go. Thank you, Douglas. Okay. Now we're going to look at that meeting, which Tom was part of.
The focus is on page 1, choosing the stories, headlines, and photos that readers will see first thing in the paper. Making those decisions is not always easy. The page 1 meeting is a discussion that is sometimes contentious, often philosophical, and always grounded in the desire to present the readers with the best possible stories.
He is.
Editors love
What a handsome young editor.
Yeah. Readers of the day's events. They debate the merits of the photos that go with the stories, making sure page 1 is not only visually appealing.
I'm going to do two more of these. everyone's got to, you got to see the press, right? That's the most exciting part. So here you're going to get a tour of the old press room a little bit.
When the press operator is satisfied that he has a good copy, he increases the speed of the press. Running speed, the press will print approximately 25,000 papers per hour.
And our last one, this is, I think this was the last one. Maybe I don't have the last one. You know what?
It's there.
Is it there, Tommy? I gotta do a little cheat, everybody. Sorry about this. Fifth clip, and now I have to escape from this. Sorry, I have to get out of this. To it. Did it go in? I don't think it did go.
I don't think you clicked.
No, you don't think it clicks. Sorry about the technical difficulties about this.
Oh, you're gonna click the
I'm
wall.
just gonna get the hyperlink and open the hyperlink. Here we go. Yep. And here we go. I just want to say this really was genuinely exciting when you first there.
It's not just newsprint is fed to the press.
Here, this is under Sentinel. This is in the basement where the rolls of the newsprint. What year? Oh, 1999. Oh.
1999.
Papers out of each roll brings about a ton. There's over 60% recycled paper. On any given night, the Sentinel will go through 7 or 8
Rolls. That's what they meant to say. Okay, so that's our TV show. What do you think of that? How many people have done a tour of the newsroom before? Okay. Okay, I'll get the presentation back up and let's go back to this.
So where is the Sentinel located today, physically?
There's Dan probably can tell you better than I. There's an office of distribution of papers out at Harvey West. But this is what I was going to bring up, is what's incredible about that is for many years, for my whole career, that was the number of people who were at the Sentinel. Ad reps, there were classified ad people who would take in ads. And there were over 100 people that were working there. A newspaper now will employ maybe 10. And in the newsroom, we had 43 at our height. Today, there would be maybe 5. And that includes editors. So when I looked at that video, I couldn't believe my eyes about how I used to live, because that would be the size that would be the size of a newspaper like a major Newark, New Jersey paper, San Francisco Chronicle. But that I would have a horrible time in today's world. There would be no newsroom. Half of the fun of being at a paper is you could kick around ideas. You could ask for a synonym for a word that you couldn't think of. There's always somebody around to get some energy going. And if you were just sitting at home, it's hard to think about what it would take to get some energy to get your story in on time and really good. And you're on the phone with people. And you're working out of your house or a coffee shop. So that I was just stunned when I saw that. I really hardly remembered how many people we used to have.
So anyway, that was the ordinary world. That was the world that we both came up in. I worked at 4 different newspapers. Every one of them was like that. And so we're going to talk about what happened, talk about it, 4 decades of change. And basically, we started in the 1980s when it was still pretty ordinary. But it was going corporate. We go to the 1990s, and that's when the business model was starting to lose its luster, is when the internet first started the World Wide Web first emerged. in the hero's journey, that was the call to adventure. And frankly, for a lot of newspapers, it was what you call the refusal of the call. And we'll talk a bit more about that. For a long time, they were a bit arrogant and they thought, well, we don't have to care about this newfangled thing called the World Wide Web. And then we'll go to the 2000s, and that's when the internet really disrupted things. And that's in the hero's journey, that's crossing the threshold into this new world. We had left that world behind that you just saw. And when I say we, I mean journalism, journalists. And it was a lot of tests. We had to find our allies, and we had a lot of enemies. And then in the 2010s, that's when the hedge funds took over. And really, that was the beginning of what we're calling the ordeal. And you're entering the cave, and you're in this, you know,
With the
very-
bad guy.
with the bad guy. That is actually where we are now. So we're going to talk about it as the beginning of the ordeal today. All right.
Let's go back to the 80s.
Let's go back to the 80s. And I mean, I always start, but I want Tom. Tom is the star here, really. So in the ordinary world, what I want you to notice in this slide is how parallel we were, 300 or 400 miles apart, but the same things were happening at our respective papers. I was in a paper in Santa Monica, and he was here in the Santa Cruz paper. And both of them were kind of on the smaller, moderate-sized papers. My paper peaked in circulation at 35,000 in the early 1970s. Tom's maybe around 30,000. And then in the early 80s, both of them, which had been historically owned by local families who started the paper because they were part of the community and they cared about it, they had to get out. And so they sold it. In my case, it sold to a family-run corporation that the flagship paper was the San Diego Union Tribune, and they wanted to expand it into Los Angeles area. So it's called Copy Press. In Tom's case, the McPherson family sold to Ottawa Newspapers, which was a division of Dow Jones. But I wanted to now hand it over to Tom to talk about that first day when it sold.
Well,
and why they sold it.
Well, what's so amazing about today's story about the newspaper is when you start, and when I worked the first 10 or 15 years of the paper, nothing changed. I came to work, I did stories. And typically what happens to journalists who are in a stable position at a newspaper is you're covering everyday stories, you're busy, you're not thinking about it, and suddenly you realize 10 years have gone by, you're 10 years older, and you're still doing the same thing. Well, one morning on April 13th, the Tuesday, we were called into the office, and as we were walking into the office, there were these two guys, gray slacks, blue sport coats, looking very East Coast. And I was walking in, I said, "What's going on?" And this guy said to me, "We were sold. The paper was sold. It's not the McPhersons anymore." And that wasn't necessarily bad news. That was a horrible thing to hear in 2010, 2015, because chances are you were being sold to a hedge fund. But the Ottawa newspaper group was very interesting and actually is responsible for improving the Sentinel a lot during the 1980s. Ottawa newspapers were wholly owned by Dow Jones and Company, which was the Wall Street Journal. And there were two commitments that Ottawa newspapers were making in buying another paper. One, they wanted to keep the local staff. They wanted to keep the newspaper as local as possible, as little change from a family-owned paper. And the way their strategy worked, because the papers like the Sentinel were willing to sell to a company like that had some ethics to it. And throughout the 80s, after the Ottawas came in, I don't know if Dan would agree with this or not, our paper got better. We had a lot of training. People came out from the East Coast. We had all of a sudden we had vice presidents reading our newspaper and commenting on it. saying you did this well, you didn't do this well, and we basically raised the professionalism. And it was exciting to work there. So I didn't have a bad feeling about a newspaper being sold. We happened to be sold to a good company. We complained about them as you complained about everything. But some of these other groups, like you've heard of Gannett, you've heard of there was the Journal newspapers, and it was if you got sold to Gannett, you went out and partied because you knew that you were going to lose staff, you were going to lose probably get a new editor who didn't know anything about your local town. So as I say, we had it lucky. I would quibble with the way that the headline, which they made us write, that it was hardly a merger. But it worked. It fit. If the headline fit, so
So Tom, I need to stand closer.
yeah.
Okay.
Tom's voice carries all the way to the.
Oh, I see. So, okay. So, Tom, I wanted you to just go over real briefly why the McPhersons had to sell.
Yeah. Is there a question? Yeah.
Well, no, I find out that the Honig were related to Dow Jones.
Yeah.
Because when I came to Santa Cruz, there was that Wall Street Journal Sunday.
In the Sentinel, he's pointing out that in our Sunday edition we had a special section of the Dow Jones, of the Wall Street Journal in our paper, which they made available to us really at no cost, and they were good stories. So there was a whole section from the Wall Street Journal. The other story I can tell about the Wall Street Journal is, and I later got to know this guy, the city editor at the Wall Street Journal. I'd made a formal request through our vice president to if we could get access to the Wall Street Journal stories when they were live, so we would have the same story maybe that was in the journal. I thought that would be kind of a cool thing to do. So the request went in, the city editor looked at the vice president, he said, no, and if you tell me to do it, I will quit. And so that was the end of that.
You tried.
So it was a small company. I mean, people did stuff like that.
Well, share though why the
Yeah.
McPhersons needed to sell.
This is the business behind it. Is what happened in the 80s is as the family-owned papers aged, the inheritance laws were brutal, and if you pass the newspaper on to another family member, or younger family members, you would lose 60% of your profit or your money in taxes. The inheritance tax on those businesses were really high. And on top of that, the second thing that I didn't know until I learned this a few days ago, that newspaper chains, the larger chains, with the profits, any profits that they made, if they put it into buying a new newspaper, they had no taxes. It was an ultimate tax dodge. So the way was clear. Essentially, what was going to happen is every family-owned newspaper was going to get sold to a company, because there were two different reasons that they were just extremely lucrative. And just one final thing, in the 1980s, newspapers were printing money. It was the most lucrative business you could possibly be in. You had profit margins of 30-40%. To be clear, the Sentinel never made it to that high. It was never that wealthy. But we had profit margins of probably up to 20% in those years, which is pretty damn good. A lot of papers were pulling down 40 to 50% a year. It's unheard of today, obviously.
In any business. But I wanted to share this chart here. You're seeing that it has the blue line that's going up and the red line that's going down. The red line going down, this begins in 1900, okay, and it goes all the way up to the current time. And what's going on there is that's the independently owned newspapers. So in the 19th century, most of these papers were owned by local families. And then you see it just started to change all through the 20th century. And then you see they cross around 1940. What was happening, that blue line, that's the corporations. That's the media organizations. And that chart on the, you can see it kind of bumps up a lot in 1955, right here, and keeps climbing until around 1975. That is the number of newspaper groups or companies that owned more than 2 dailies. Okay, so you're just seeing that corporate. And when you become owned by a corporation, you become more vulnerable to the vagaries of corporate life. Some of them were, publicly owned. They had to make a profit. As you heard, that wasn't a big problem in the 1980s, but that was going to change in the next few decades.
Right? After cynical.
Yeah.
Well, if you guys have, if your profit margins were so good, of course you guys were going to be profitable. Because
Yeah.
obviously they look at your business. So maybe if you hadn't made so much money, you would.
Yeah.
Well, the funny thing is with the people who work on those numbers, they don't like to see numbers going down.
Ever.
And so I think we were headed, and we're going to get into that, by setting up such a profitable industry. And as we lost readers and lost advertising, somebody was going to get left holding the bag. And newspapers, that's why you could have 100 people working in the newspaper and you could have 10 today, because that's where the money used to go to newsprint and salaries. That was the main part of the money.
When they were in the buying spree, I read something, they were paying 13 times earnings. They were really paying a lot of money for these because they were such cash cows. And then when the cow was no longer producing milk, then it.
As an example, the Boston Globe sold to the New York Times for $1 billion in the 80s. $1 billion. And that newspaper is probably worth maybe 15 million now. $1 billion.
So
And nobody knew what well,
Yeah,
we're going from
we're gonna go ahead.
into the tragic area.
I thought we would take a moment. I don't know if we're going to be moving the microphones around at all for this, but I'm going to ask you this question twice. I'm going to ask it right now, which is if you can remember back to the 1980s, and I know a lot of time has passed, but how did you learn about local events and issues in your community? When it came time to vote, what information resources did you review? And when you wanted to get informed about a local issue, where did you look? And did you feel at the time that you could find all the local information that you needed? Just a pulse check on how things felt back then. I think it is on.
Yeah.
Hello, hello.
I know that's sometimes because now you have a microphone and it's hard to speak. I always say ignore it, just hold it in your hand and ask the question. You can ask.
I'm holding it in my hand. That's it.
So
But
think back. I think
can you
Alex
remember
said-
those days? How you got information is different from today?
Yeah, let's talk about how it was different.
The good times. is what We looked at to find out what was going on locally, or music, or theater, or whatever. And it's still functioning for local news. I was missing something in depth, international.
Uh-huh.
I wasn't looking for local news from the Sentinel, because, yeah.
Thank you.
We got comments from Zoom. They just saying the Sentinel, the Scotts Valley Banner, the Mercury, Walter's Journal.
They had a lot of resources they were looking at.
I thought that one of the things that happened was the Sentinel started to depend on press releases from various organizations instead of doing investigative things. And I thought we missed that. I mean, that's what we need.
Right.
Yeah.
But back then, going back to the 1980s, I know it's changed so much now. But back then, you did feel like there was some in-depth Yeah.
I run
Uh-huh.
from New York, and of course we had tons of investigative reporting going on there. And I looked for it here, and there were lots of controversies, and there still are, right?
Yeah.
We tend to have columns and letters to the editor as the way we get different perspectives.
Interesting.
Big hours in that question. You know?
Yeah,
Yes.
I wasn't here for most of the 80s. I was living abroad, but except when I was working at the Sentinel, but I was in college. So did I pay attention to local issues? I'm sure I remember. But as I mentioned before, the movies, you had to go to the paper to find out what was going on in town. I don't remember the good times back then. Was it here then?
Yeah, it was.
So,
Yeah, in a way, you could say that the good times rose up because the Sentinel was not covering entertainment very well, and it came up. The guy who did it, a good friend of Dan's named Jay Shore, came up. He started an alternative paper that was like the Sundays or something. It was called the Santa Cruz Times, and he wanted to do investigation. Very quickly, he saw what wasn't being served were people who liked to go to the Catalyst and listen to rock and roll. And that was the founding principle of the good times. And it's carried them through right until today. Of course, they didn't have to cover news. They didn't cover the city council. They didn't cover planning commissions. They covered rock and roll and then branched out into anything having to do with lifestyle. And the daily newspapers didn't really go after that group, and they should have because there was a lot of advertising money there. But daily newspapers are busy covering the news, and the weeklies are covering entertainment. So their goals are different, and a lot of people in Santa Cruz were looking about what to do on weekends and what movie to go to. So the Good Times was a little livelier than our paper, covering the important stuff like the important but dull stuff like the city council meetings.
we had a similar, if I could interrupt, we had a similar situation where I lived, down in Southern California. The LA Weekly was pretty much like the Good Times. And man, they had so much advertising. And Matt Honig, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, but the guy who wound up doing The Simpsons, he was the cartoonist for the LA Weekly. So it was same deal. We had something called The Reader too, the LA Reader. It was the same deal. They really didn't cover in-depth news as much. Occasionally they did, but it was a lot of the entertainment stuff.
I do remember the display ads were a big portion of the newspaper. That's where you found out if you needed any services in the community. It was in the center. Not so much today. It's a little bit of that about. I don't actually look at the ads anymore, but they were on every page and you kind of paid attention to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know if there are any other insights. Okay. Good.
Right.
So you had a lot of different.
Yeah.
You had the Metro. That was another paper. I'm repeating for the Zoom.
No, it is. And the two most important sources for me were the East Bay Times as weekly and the Mustarian another weekly. I don't know why I read.
You didn't read the Tribune?
I read. I wanted to know.
Ah. Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay. So anyway, oh, sorry. Go ahead. No, go right. Please go right ahead. I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah. You sold your home. You sold your car. You bought your car. Yeah.
Well, as we move forward, we're gonna have a look at what happened to that advertising, and you have to keep in mind the the mind of advertisers is interesting. Virtually anybody who's advertising their business will tell you, half my money is being wasted. It's going somewhere where I'm not getting a single sale. The problem is, I don't know which half it is. So they have to spend the whole thing. As we will see, advertisers got a little bit more pointed in their strategy. And that's where I think we go from here. And that will led to a lot of things that hit directly at the pocketbook of newspapers. And when you hit it at the pocketbook, they only have one place to cut, and that's their workforce.
Yeah. So now we go into the 1990s, and 1989 is when the World Wide Web was first unveiled, and this was a really interesting time for me. I remember, being really fascinated by the World Wide Web. And I was very curious about, can our newspaper be part of this somehow? I was really interested in like the graphical user interface, all the stuff that we take for granted now. I saw it. I was doing a feature story in the early 90s. The Museum of Tolerance had just opened in Century City. And I was given a preview, and they were walking me around, and they showed me upstairs where they had a whole section for school children. And it was what we would now recognize as a computer lab. I had never really seen one quite like that before. And I was fascinated. And I thought, this is the future. I was very excited. It was the call to adventure, going back to our notion of the hero's journey. But when I went back to the office and I was talking with my bosses and the editors, they didn't quite get it. I don't know how to put it, but they weren't as enthusiastic. And their attitude was sort of like, okay, Louise has a bee in her bonnet. Maybe let her do some stories where she's doing some graphics and, I think they called it computer-assisted journalism back then, or reporting. But it was kind of like an oddity, and they weren't like embracing it in any sort of big way. So it was the refusal of the call. And anyway, I'll just go quickly what happened with my newspaper. In 4 years, I went through at least 4 rounds of newsroom layoffs. And when I would walk in on a Friday, always seemed to happen on a Friday, you'd look around the newsroom and there'd be an empty desk. Like, what happened? Well, Ron got laid off, or whoever it was. And we always would have parties. That was just became part of our lifestyle. Someone else got laid off, let's have a party. But I was really starting to feel a little nervous, and the papers I had worked for before were getting sold off or they were closing. And so anyway, that's when I decided I have to get out, because I just don't see that I'm going to be able to retire. As you know, when I went back to grad school, I was working part-time for the LA Times, our competition. In the 1980s, the big papers were actually trying to expand their circulation in Los Angeles by creating zoned editions. So when I was working for the Ventura Star, they opened up a whole new zoned edition, the Ventura County page. And that really became competition for all the little newspapers that were up there. And the same thing with the West Side. And in 1995, when I was working for the West Side, that's when they got a new owner. They used to call him the Cereal King. I can't remember. He came from one of the cereal companies.
He'd been at Kellogg's.
Yeah, something like that. I can't remember. But he decided.
Cereal.
Yeah, he decided. He and his accountants decided, well, this is costing us a lot of money having all these offices spread throughout the region, the Los Angeles area. And so he shut it down. And I just want to share, I was with, on the West Side, there was a guy there who had been the bureau chief for UPI in Moscow. Okay, like I say, these jobs are hard to come by. And some of these journalists were truly illustrious. And he was there. There was a gal who used to work for the Herrex and covered the McMartin case, the child preschool case, and she came there. Anyway, they were all mid-career. They had kids heading to college. They had mortgages on the west side of Los Angeles. And they said, okay, thank you for your service. There's one job you all can compete for. It's down in Orange County. Okay, so I remember we were all out for drinks at a bar in Venice, and they just basically looked at me and because I was still thinking, I was on the bubble. I thought, well, maybe I'll, get a master's degree or something. And because there was this creeping elitism too that was happening when I got into the business. It used to be you could just kind of be a copy person, a copy boy, and rise up and become the editor of the New York Times. Tom was a friend of his. Those days were gone in the 80s. I mean, everybody I met, they had a master's degree from Columbia, or they went to an Ivy League school, and they're working at like a little paper, like the Outlook, and it just was really, really hard for business.
When the trades used to have articles about the MBA is in the newsroom now, and Santa Cruz was a little different in those days. We had it lucky in a way for a while. In '89, of course, we all remember the earthquake, and the assumption in the earthquake was that's going to be very harmful to us economically. And it ended up being just the opposite, because there was so much rebuilding and things happening in town. Our bottom line actually grew right after the earthquake. Then the other thing, as Louise was saying, Los Angeles was a special case because these newspapers down in LA kept closing. The Oxnard paper,
we had Moore Park, Oxnard, Thousand Oaks.
There were tons of little
All
papers in
right
LA.
now.
And I used to go to the state editors meetings. And I said, what happened to that guy who was here last year? Where's that guy been this year? They all were gone. Their papers were gone. In Santa Cruz, we sort of held together. And I mentioned before about the ownership of Dow Jones. They wanted to fight back. And they said, we can get better. If we start improving our paper, they increase training budget. We have people flying back for workshops on writing, workshops on investigative reporting. And then in the late 1990s, Dow Jones actually funded us the money to start a 5-person bureau in Watsonville, thinking we can expand and take in Watsonville and we can increase our business. It didn't really happen because we just did not pick up the numbers of subscribers in Watsonville. But at any rate, the point is that we were still doing active things, saying we can get better. This is a tough atmosphere, but damn it, we're going to fight. We're going to fight. The other thing we did is had a redesign of the newspaper in 2000, changed the name back from Santa Cruz County Sentinel to Santa Cruz Sentinel. We had our strategies all lined up, and we actually were expanding the staff a little bit because of Watsonville. And so I was still hopeful on into 2000 that we were going to escape some of the things that were happening all over the country, because I was reading these stories about how the business is going down. And as I said earlier, there was so much money that was in the business model of the newspapers, that if people stopped advertising and stopped taking the paper, somebody was going to left holding the bag. They were going to have a lot of investment money in something that really wasn't worth that much. And that's pretty much what we're going to see as we go forward.
We'll take a break in just a couple minutes. So the other thing I wanted to note in Los Angeles was I did meet a number of people who would go work for the LA Times. They didn't have benefits. They were very low paid, those starting jobs. But a number of them, they literally were trust fund babies. You know what I'm saying? I just had the impression that to get into journalism in the 80s and the 90s, it helped to have rich parents. Because they could support your habit, and that was not the case for me. So I was, working for these papers that had benefits and 401k and whatnot. But Tom, I know we got to do a break, but I wanted to share that you were very cognizant of things were starting to change by the mid 90s. And you were reaching out to the readers through your columns and trying to pull the curtain back to how the process worked and some of your concerns.
Yeah, there, despite the '90s being a good period economically for us, there were a lot of trends and going on in the whole country that were troubling. And among them was that people were, and somebody mentioned back there about coverage of elections. How were we going to cover elections? And with fewer people who were interested in covering it, more people were interested in doing features, and it was hard to get kind of hard news reporters. And so we would work hard at organizing how we covered our elections. And during that time, there was the number of voters were kind of diminishing. You would have an election, if it wasn't a presidential election, you might have a 30% turnout.
20%.
20%.
Just don't vote.
And so those people are not reading the stories about what candidate stands for what. These issues, of course, are still with us. The homeless situation in Santa Cruz, the cost of living in Santa Cruz, the lack of water, the traffic. Does anyone notice the traffic occasionally gets bad around here? That all cries out for coverage, and I don't know. I was concerned that we were not hitting the people where the news should hit them, and so I think I was concerned. It was interesting to go back and read some of the columns that I wrote, mostly about. Well, there was one that was about worrying about the divide between what you would call today blue states and red states. The polarization was getting bad in the 1900s. I had no idea where it was going to go from here. But reading it back now, I said, yeah, those concerns were with us. And I think I started to see the seeds of some real problems in the industry. And people simply weren't reading and that is where we're at now.
A couple other, I know
Yeah,
we're waiting for
okay.
the break, but we have the other thing we wanted to say was Sunday was actually the one bright spot. You actually expanded to include the paper was 7 days a week, or
It was 6 days a week, and then when we went to the mornings in 1986, switched from an afternoon publication to a morning publication, which was happening all over the country. Then our Sunday circulation was improving, and so it was improving in newspapers all across the country. So suddenly they were hiring more people to do Sunday features. I think this is to get back to the Good Times kind of coverage. Our Sunday paper would look more like Good Times than a Sentinel because we always had a bright feature about some entertainment issue that was going on
and it
around.
was just
Sandy.
the people, two-income
Very
family,
minor coverage.
people they were busy, they were commuting, they weren't reading every day. And so Sunday was their day to read. And you can see it in this graph real quickly. This is the circulation of newspapers nationally going from 1940 to 2020. And you can see the weekday is that red one. And that little pale one is Sunday. And as you can see in the 1990s, Sunday started to go above. That was the circulation bright spot for a lot of newspapers, was the Sunday paper. The other thing I wanted to share with you, this is from like 1998 or something, the Pew. Basically, you can see the newspaper, actually 2004. 1994, if you did a survey of just people who followed the media, 58% were reading newspapers. By 2004, 42%. And down, you look at the bottom line here on online news, nobody was really looking at online news that much in 1994, but a third, close to a third, 29% by 2004, that's where they're getting their news. And then we just started to see the layoffs and, people starting to cut. So that was that. And I think we'll take our break now. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, bye.
Okay, welcome back. So we're now leaving the last century behind. We're all millennials now. We're going to start talking about the 2000s. And this is when the internet really disrupted the newspaper model. And again, on the hero's journey, we're crossing the threshold, as I mentioned before. We're dealing with tests, allies, and enemies into this new world. And you see the vultures. Those are vultures. So I just share, you might wonder, well, what happened to you after journalism? So I actually was so fascinated by the new technology and it's a way to design and share information that I majored, that's what I wound up studying in grad school in the Department of Education at UCLA. And it was all the technology was new and a lot of the focus was on kids. But truth to tell, I was always interested in adult learning and how you could revise or reform or change journalism or just information dissemination to really make information sticky and easy for people to use as adults, busy working adults. So I completed my doctoral thesis and I wound up studying something that was really focused on 12th graders who were finishing their civics class. And I had them reading news stories or opinion pieces around the same topics. And then I, quizzed them about some things about, did they like the genre? Which genre did they like better? Which did they feel like they were learning more from? And which did they actually learn? Like I had a few knowledge questions in there. And really what it came out to was think about this today. They really dislike the opinion pieces. Think about where we are today. Our young people, I went to like 3 or 4 different high schools, all in Northern California, and there were a few hundred participants. And that was the overwhelming bit of feedback is please stop the opinions. It seems uncivil. People they're kind of rude to each other. I don't really feel like I understand what you're talking about. I feel like I've walked into the middle of an argument. People are yelling at each other and I don't know what's going on. That's how the young people were seeing it. They did like the news stories though. Why? Because it was just laying it out. It was saying, you have your turn. Now you get your turn. And we're going to put it together. And I know there's concern about both sides of ism. I get that. And we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. But there is something to be said for just letting people say their pieces and presenting it, right? Both sides. So anyway, then I came up to Menlo Park. I was working for a research and development company called SRI International. And I actually am sort of semi-retired. I'm still working for them now. And basically my job was to write grants now and go make some money around how you can improve education and learning. And they were very focused on using technology. Well, I really tried to do some journalistic learning grants, but for a lot of different reasons having to do with how little money was in that field. There was no interest in funding civic education. And the money for journalism was very low dollars. And that just was not going to work for my company. I couldn't stay employed. So I did manage to get a colleague from UC Berkeley who was a cognitive scientist, and he had done some work that showed that if you interject what they call base rates into a news story so that people get a context, it isn't just a cop killing, right? Oh, the cops are getting killed, right? You read this story, it becomes very salient. Well, if you just put a little line in there that says the percentage, the average rate of cops getting killed is X, and it turns out to be rather low, minuscule, in fact. It actually, he did a test and it changed people's views of policy. So what I'm trying to share with you is that if you put certain types of information in there, it does become very powerful. It's a way to help people make sense, to stimulate the thinking. Now, if people were highly opinionated, very polarized, there was nothing that was going to change their minds. They would go farther into the direction, no matter what base rate you gave them. But it was this large group in the middle that were actually open and trying to learn. So anyway, I wanted to take some time to explain his theory and his work, because when I heard that, I said, let's do something together with journalism. And we approached my local paper that at the time, the San Mateo County Times, I talked to Tom at the Sentinel, and I was trying to get the journalists into this, like, hey, guys want to give this a try. Well, the Sentinel, it was kind of a lukewarm response. And Tom might want to talk about that more. But what really was actually stunning to me, and it goes to our whole theme, what was happening to the business model. I went to visit the San Mateo County Times, and this was a big paper. Okay, I can't remember the circulation, but it was a big paper.
40,000.
It was a big newspaper, traditional newspaper office, just like you saw in the beginning. It was hollowed out. I walked in for an appointment with the editor. I could not believe it was like 2004, 2005. You walked in, the classified section was just a cavern of empty desks. There was not a soul in the room. Those classified ads had gone to Craigslist. It was over. And then I'm looking, where's the newsroom? So I kind of look over in the other direction. And you see this, again, just this cavernous, hollowed out space with all kinds of desks that used to be buzzing like a beehive with lots of people. There was one table with a few bags of chips and some soda with the light shining down, right? And I kind of walked over to that table thinking there must be life around here. And I looked over and I saw the editor and two reporters in a glass room where they were ready to meet me. When I talked to them about what I wanted to do, they're like, yeah, we'd love to do it. As you can see, things aren't going that well. So it didn't get that far with them. Nor did it get too far with the Sentinel because things were really going downhill fast. And at the same time, we both got involved they talked about hyperlocal. Like there's got to be a new business model. And the buzzword was hyperlocal. So these small, independently run, usually backed by philanthropists, this was going to be the new business model. No more advertising. We don't need advertising. Who needs advertising? And so we participated in the founding of one that's still around. It's called the San Francisco Public Press, and that model has proliferated throughout the United States. And I talk about the enemies. I just want my former paper, it got shut down in 1998, and a lot of my former colleagues wound up starting their own online version of that. But in 2009, the whole corporation shut down, and they sold out to who else? An investor group. So we'll talk about how the whole movement over to the hedge funds happened. I know I took a lot of time there, but
Well, the best part of it was the day that Louise called me after visiting. She called. I think she was sitting in the car after that experience, and she called me and said, "What the hell is happening in newspapers?" And she described this sort of futuristic movie or Twilight Zone kind of show about the disappearing. All the staff had disappeared somewhere. We in Santa Cruz, as I told you, we remained hopeful on into the 2000s.
but it changed fast.
But
It changed.
yeah, when the bathtub gets emptied, it goes down really fast. And Louise and I had only recently started dating, and we were sort of comparing notes about what we were seeing in the business. She had already gotten out of the business. I was not enjoying myself. We had basically what happened almost in the space of a year is we went from saying, how can we be creative? How can we do the best stories? How can we illustrate them well? How can we get into the lives of people and understand, do a better job? And then you would have a meeting with the business side, and all of a sudden you had to lay off 6 people. And then another time you would lay off 4 people. And
you were sold 2 times.
yeah, and then in 2006, I took a day off. My father and mother were getting older, and I took them down to Monterey to have lunch with them. I hadn't seen them in a while. We went down, and when I was on my way back, I got a phone call that said, "We just got sold again." We got sold to a teachers' pension group out of Alabama called
CN.
CNHI. They didn't own any other paper in California. The closest paper was Missouri, I think. And so they owned us for 6 weeks. And then this was kind of strange. I had an eye doctor appointment, so I went to the eye doctor's, and the ophthalmologist or
Optometrist.
optometrist's wife said, "Your paper got sold again." I said, I don't think so, but maybe. And sure enough, the next day, a bus arrived, and the editors at the San Jose Mercury, which were part of a group called Media News Group, which now owns the Sentinel, had arrived on a bus, and they kind of literally came in. I mean, were you at work that day, Dan?
Trying not to remember.
It's blocking. That's covering something.
There was a car fire in Watson.
Yeah.
So it went quick, and I decided that I was not going to be there much longer with more layoffs. So I went in and I said, how many people are we losing? I had already qualified for a pension through Dow Jones. So I said, no, these people don't have a pension. So I said, how many jobs would it save? It turned out between 2 and 3 jobs got saved, at least for a while. And I left, and I had no plans to leave, but it just got to be a situation that the day my mother said, "You look miserable. Why don't you just quit?" That was it for me. So 2007, I made the decision to leave, and since then I've stayed relatively close to people at the Sentinel. I even have written an editorial or two. My name wasn't on it, but it has made it into the paper when the current editorial page editor was gone and needed me to do something. Yeah, you can see this is pretty typical of when somebody leaves. The rest of the staff says, "How are we going to give them a newspaper to leave with?" That was their version of it.
And then ENT, I don't know if people even know what that is. That's editor and publisher. That was the big trade publication. So, your departure noted there.
So,
But I wanted to share, can I share this one too? Tom doesn't. So we were involved with this group of young folks up in San Francisco, founding that hyperlocal institution. And I was telling you about a media source. And a lot of them were connected with the Northern California chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. And they honored Tom because of the gesture, where he basically sacrificed his own job to save some other jobs. And they gave him this award in 2008, the Vanishing Journalist. And I just wanted to share the national media trends. So that graph on the right there, that red is the newspaper classified ad sales. And this is tracking from 2003 to 2009. And you can see right around the time that the Sentinel was sold, 2006, 2007, that's when that starts to trend down pretty steeply on a national level. At the same time, you see this blue line. Well, that's Craigslist. And look how they're doing. Look at how they're doing in terms of ads. So, and they just kind of crisscross around 2007. And what's happening in this one, the chart on the left, you see some numbers here, 2005, 2006, 2007, $20 billion. Well, what was going on there? Basically, that was what people were paying for papers. Remember, I told you they were paying sometimes 13 times earnings. I don't know if they were paying that level at this point. But then you see something happening from 2008 on. It's not that much money that they're paying anymore. Well, what's happened now is these corporations that bought things up, this is what exactly happened to Media News. They were holding the bag, and they had a lot of debt. They borrowed a lot of money to buy all these papers. They couldn't service the debt once the ad rates went down and so forth. The circulation was never really the big factor. It was always the ads. And so they just had to get rid of this thing. It was like distressed property, just get this thing off my balance sheet so I can avoid bankruptcy. And so it was a fire sale. And at that point, it was the bottom feeders and the hedge funds who
Yeah.
came in. And they had no interest. I just want to say this. This is strictly accounting. This has nothing to do with the Constitution or that role that newspapers have that's carved out the First Amendment. They don't. I talked to a neighbor of mine who's a stockbroker. When I talk to him about stuff like civics, history, and the founding fathers or any of that stuff, he says, it doesn't matter. All that matters is the money. And that's really kind of where we are today, in my opinion, as a country.
Well, let me take a minute to talk about financing of newspapers. And there's one thing we haven't really mentioned, that is back in the days when advertising brought in a lot of money. How many people here felt we can't really trust what the Sentinel is saying or the newspaper is saying because they're running these ads and they're going to favor the people who are running ads. Did anyone feel that way, that there was something inherently wrong about that system? Because as it turns out, what people have realized now is that system of general advertising for a newspaper was not a bad system. You had people who were funding it. We had, for example, remember Lee's department store? They spent, they were our biggest advertiser for years and years and years. They financed a lot of what we did. Never once did I hear a complaint about our news coverage from them. What the reality is that we were financed by the advertisers, and it was a system that worked. Today, there's not enough advertising. They're not paying for it. So who is paying for your journalism? Subscribers and also interest groups. Now, they may be good interest groups. They may be environmentally oriented. They may be any number of things. But if they're an interest group, they're interested in having you cover what they want you to cover. Advertisers did not really care what we covered. That was not where the pressure came from. It was a system that worked. And I didn't realize it until I was actually researching some of this information for this. And now, with them off the scene, virtually anybody who will put up, why would somebody put money toward a newspaper or a website or any piece of journalism? Seems to me they have an interest in the subject and want to have their opinion backed up. It's almost as if in today's world you would put out a newspaper and say anything with a red headline is going to be from a Republican standpoint. Anything with a blue headline is going to be an article how the Democrats feel about it. And nobody reads the other column. And that's the situation. And going back to one of the things that I said at the beginning, the press is mentioned in the Bill of Rights. It's important. It is something that is beyond commercialization. And we have got to get back to a situation where people are sharing the same information. And as the newspaper has gone away, nothing seems to be replacing it yet. But we're not giving up.
And we're not giving up, but I did want to, we're going to go into the 2010s, and this is when we say the ordeal begins. We're already talking about the ordeal a little bit from our perspective. You see the guy going into the cave here. So from afar, I'm watching the LA Times, which was I loved that paper, okay? And to see what that has become today breaks my heart. And, truth to tell, they were already realizing in the late 90s. I remember when I was in grad school, I had a potential internship gig helping them launch their digital side. It didn't pan out, but they early on, they saw we've got to get with it. And they're still trying to figure it out. My research that I told you about with my colleague, Michael Ranney, I wound up writing an article with him. We put it in a journal about our research. He actually expanded it to include more than just base rates, but base concepts. So putting a little bit of science into articles too, just explain like the physics of global warming and things like that. So people are learning a bit. And anyway, it was all very effective. I'll just put it that way. And we published this article in a peer-reviewed journal. It was very well received. And we just found out this year it was the best article in the journal for 2017. I had no idea. But it was seen that way because it was a different direction from what we see today. And we'll talk more about it next time, about sort of playing to people's biases, telling them what they want to hear, because please like me, please, and please keep bringing the money in, keep looking at my advertising, because then I can pay people on TV, 30 million bucks a year to lie to you. I mean, that's essentially the new business model. It's working. Why stop? Why stop? It's making money. The accountants are in charge. Tom, in the meantime, you tried to blog for a while. And tell them why you stopped doing the blog, because I think that's telling.
Honestly, I wrote opinion pieces in the editorial, and I got tired of my opinion and everybody else's opinion. It was so in the blog. The world seems a certain way to me, but sometimes it's would be considered a liberal opinion. Sometimes it would be a conservative opinion. Sometimes it would be a lunatic fringe opinion that I would have. And I was interested in what led me to that point. And what I've noticed in the world around me and in journalism, what is the least attractive thing to me now is everybody wants to produce opinion and news and wants to produce their own journalistic endeavor. Who's left to listen?
Yeah.
Who are we listening to? When I watch a cable news show, which cable news is sort of taken over the dialogue, does anyone ever say, I never thought of that, I agree with what you said? It's this road show of people hurling insults at each other. And that's it. That's journalism.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Right.
It's with farm workers for 15 years, and they all listen to the radio. And I thought, wow, this is great. We ought to put out some good stuff on the radio that, would be like, educational, in-depth, something or another. And then I heard that the Republican Party or powers on that side bought up every, I will not swear in Spanish, every station on the radio dial that was available. Is that true?
Yeah.
I-
Well, her question is that in certain Latino areas, the radio is a very big deal, and that is it possible that opposition to the people would purchase so much radio time that their message couldn't get through? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah.
Tom, there's a message from Maureen on Zoom. She said, keep the faith, Tom. Many of us read our newspapers cover to cover, or the digital equivalent here in Davenport, as there's no newspaper delivered here in the boondocks.
Yay! Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and I think the big question that is behind all this is you get the information you get in newspapers you get by reading, and our culture is moving away from reading and to the video and to the social media. So I guess our question going forward is going to be more in the area of where do we get this back? Where do we get back to the listening to each other and people learning before they have an opinion?
Just a quick question. If on the trend line, since the trend line has been going down for some time, I've never understood why hedge funds are interested in purchasing.
The question is about
what's the
What is the business model?
why are hedge funds able to make money? Their strategy is to get rid of almost every expense that they possibly can. Salinas, California still puts out a newspaper, but they have 0 reporters. They don't have a single reporter. They have some editor put together a newsroom somewhere.
I mean, is the end game that they're going to just close it down? They're just gonna.
They're going to continue taking what they can. And if there's, sometimes it's national ads. There'll be it used to be tobacco. We could always get tobacco ads. They're not going to get local ads, but they will get advertising for cell phones and things like that.
And
So-
they sold off, like they sold off properties. And
Yeah, they sold off properties, so they'll get money any way that they can, and they figure a little bit is enough because their expenses are extremely low. The other thing is they've taken all the presses. The Sentinel is printed in Chico, and it's brought down by bus.
Locally, the Alden Global, who owned Sentinel, they saw it as, look at this fantastic property downtown.
Exactly.
So they sold that. It's a different, there's a number of businesses in there now. I believe they sold the press too.
Yeah,
But which went down a cliff and never flown over. I believe that.
well, that and what we talked about that is true. When they pulled out the press, it blocked all lanes of Highway 17. And we told each other that this was a good way for the newspaper to ruin the lives of people who didn't even read the newspaper.
In the back. Oh, okay.
So there can be one voice that puts out their information.
Well, the woman comments that the papers are being put out so there will be one voice. Certainly, Jeff Bezos has had an impact on the Washington Post, and CBS News is going through quite a change. So I don't know where this is going to go. I like to believe that there should be a free flow of information where we all have access to the same information. That's our goal in talking.
I recall once upon a time, rules or laws about how many newspapers you could own, how many radio stations you could own.
Yes, it didn't affect the newspapers because because of the Constitution, they can't make laws about newspapers, but they sure as hell can about somebody who owns a paper and a TV station and a radio station.
Those still in effect, laws?
I think
Yeah,
there's still some
yeah,
monopoly,
they are, but
anti-monopoly.
is there anybody around that will
But there's,
enforce the action?
yeah, if you go to some parts of the country when I was traveling, that some of these areas like Sinclair, some of these TV, it's just fascinating. I remember I went back there, I was in a hotel, and it was one shot to get to Fox News, super easy. That was everywhere. But I was in like Northeast Tennessee. And I had been visiting back there about several times, but this last time, right in the 2024 election, I had to like use my technical skills to find CNN. You know what I'm saying? Like it was not evident. It wasn't easy to find on the television set. I'm just sharing that. Very strange. But anyway, I did want to share real quickly. You see this gray, see this little circle here on the right? You see like a teeny little gray here, and it's a big gray. It's like half of it. Those are like the hedge funds. That's who owns most media companies, newspapers today. You can see that change. And this is 2014. That has gotten even bigger. And then you see our circulation dropping from 2004 to 2014. And then in the meantime, employment dropped 26%, 2008, 2020. And most of those, like 40 some percent of those people were the older people, the mid-career. And Tom and I told you, those people were very important in the newsroom because the young kids, they don't know. They've just come out of school. They don't really understand how the community works, how things get done. And I don't know who's teaching them now because we used to rely on the senior folks. They would help us. They're gone now.
Well, I mentioned about training that we received and trying to make the newspaper better. The owner of the Sentinel would not be able to find Santa Cruz on a map. I can assure you that. He's probably never heard of Santa. And that's the ownership, and they're pulling out what they can, and if they can make a buck here, that's better than nothing. If they can't make it cash flow, they'll fire somebody else
Or
until,
just shut it down.
or shut it down.
The other thing I wanted to share here real quickly, I know we're getting to the end of time, is this has been a field day for media researchers, okay? And I just wanted to share this one set of articles that I found. Staffing declines matter. When you're starting to lay off half your staff, might seem obvious, but he actually did this for hundreds of newspapers throughout the United States, and he looked at their staffing levels, and then he looked at their content, like they analyzed the content to see how much of it was government, other sorts of things, and that local government coverage just went way down. It was a significant, statistical relation, and so it has an impact. You're not getting the information. We're out of time at this point. I want to be respectful. And I think next time we can talk a lot more about where we are today, the ordeal, as we call it. We're in the thick of it right now. How are we going to find our way out? Yeah.
News. I used to travel all over the United States, and every single hotel I went into had U.S. News and World Report,
Mm-hmm.
Which was just everywhere. Is that still around?
Is it?
I haven't seen a copy of
I've
it.
seen a copy of that in a long time. But you're right. That used to be. Yeah.
Well, and going to the doctor's office, there's not a magazine anywhere because everybody's sitting looking at their phone.
But anyway, I really appreciate your listening to us. I know it was a lot of talking. We'll share the deck with you. I have a lot of citations in there if you're interested. You don't have to. And we're going to talk about the hero's journey. Is there a way back from where we are today? That's next time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Later.